Chapter 1. Hertfordshire, November 1811. A frantic dash throughout the halls of Longbourn ended triumphantly when Mrs. Bennet found her husband in the library, with his head buried in one of the many books scattered about on his desk. If 23 years of marriage had taught her anything, she would have known he did not wish to be disturbed, especially at that particular moment. Alas, not being inclined to learn such lessons, the lady of the house approached him directly. Wringing her hands in her apron, one which she donned more for show than functionality, for she was not inclined to do such menial tasks as housework, she cried, "Oh, Mr. Bennet!" The gentleman did not bother to look up from his book. "Mr. Bennet," said his lady to him once again, this time with more urgency in her voice, "you must allow me to tell you what happened at Lucas Lodge last evening." His eyes trained on the page before him, he responded, "No doubt you wish to tell me which lady wore what and who shunned whom. Can it not wait a while longer? At the very least, until I finish this chapter." A determined matriarch, whose business in life was marrying off her 5 daughters, she placed her hands on her hips in defiance. "It most certainly will not wait. And as it pertains to Lizzie, the one daughter to whom you always given the preference, you will want to hear what I have to say just as eagerly as I wish to say it." Indeed, of Thomas Bennet's 5 daughters, all of them out of society and neither of them married, his second eldest, Elizabeth, was his favorite. There was a quickness about her that none of her sisters possessed. With no sons to divert him, much less inherit his estate, which was entailed to the male line, his second-born child was Mr. Bennet's greatest consolation. Known for his dry humor and sardonic wit, the gray-haired patriarch peered over his spectacles at his wife. "Lizzie, you say? I knew the mere mention of her name would command your attention." Mr. Bennet turned his book face down on the desk and leaned back in his chair. "Indeed, you have my undivided attention. Pray, do not keep me in suspense." "I have reason to hope that Lizzie has an admirer, and one who happens to be from a most unexpected quarter, I might add." "You speak as though such a prospect comes as a surprise to you." "Why, I am more than surprised. I declare I am completely flabbergasted, as you too will be when you learn the gentleman's identity." "Now that you have sufficiently prepared me to be amazed, I beg you to reveal this mysterious admirer's name." "It is that proud Mr. Darcy," Mrs. Bennet exclaimed with energy. Her husband scoffed. "Surely you are mistaken, for I know with certainty that Lizzie does not like the gentleman, owing to his insulting remark the evening of the marriage and assembly. Words to the effect that she is not handsome enough to tempt him, if I recall correctly." "Indeed, you do recall correctly. Mr. Darcy said our Lizzie was tolerable, which explains why I find myself completely at odds over what to think or how to feel about this new development." "What evidence do you have to support your suspicions that the proud Mr. Darcy's opinion of my Lizzie has changed?" "Why, he danced with her for one, when he might have danced with any number of single ladies in the room, including his so-called intimate friend, Miss Caroline Bingley." Always fatigued by his wife's raptures, Mr. Bennet took a deep breath and blew it out just as quickly. Drawing himself up to his desk as though he meant to resume reading, he said, "Is this the sole basis for your theory?" "There is more. The two were seen speaking to each other on the balcony afterward. Mr. Darcy even raised our Lizzie's hand to his lips before parting." Mr. Bennet arched his bushy brow. "Then what you are saying is that Mr. Darcy is a true gentleman after all. Shall we have the banns read?" "I did not say he offered his hand in marriage, at least not yet, but I do believe such a prospect is not beyond the realm of possibility." "Ah, from dislike to like, from like to matrimony, so easily as that. The rapidity of the inner workings of the female mind never ceases to amaze me, especially when the future of a single gentleman of large fortune is at stake," he said in jest, barely able to mask his amused expression. "You may laugh at me all you like, but you will not dampen my spirits one bit. A mother knows these things after all. Mark my words. There will be not just one but 2 weddings at Netherfield in 3 months, or my name is not Mrs. Francine Bennet." "You will pardon me, my dear, if I do not celebrate just yet, for I do not know precisely what your assertion portends. Either I will gain a son-in-law, or 2, or I will not have had the pleasure of calling you my wife for the past couple decades." A woman of mean understanding, little information, and uncertain temper who fancied herself as being of a nervous constitution when she was discontented, she cried, "Oh, Mr. Bennet, how you enjoy vexing me, but it simply will not do, especially today." "Pray, what makes today different from any other day?" "Did I not tell you? Lizzie is expecting a gentleman caller today." Turning on her heel, she proceeded to quit the room. Reaching for the doorknob, she looked back and faced her husband. "It is Mr. Darcy." Chapter 2. A Convenient Excuse. When Jane strode into the bedroom she shared with her sister Elizabeth, a delightful smile spread across her angelic countenance. "Lizzie," she said, "I certainly did not expect to see you. It is early still. I have never known you to return from your morning walk so soon." Jane sat on the bed beside her sister and took Elizabeth's hand in hers. "Could your shortened ramble have anything at all to do with the expected arrival of a certain distinguished gentleman? Although, I confess, I am not completely satisfied by your explanation for the sudden change in your opinion of Mr. Darcy." In truth, Elizabeth could scarcely comprehend it either. However, she could not be nearly so bothered to understand it all as was her sister. She rather supposed a tiny part of her thought somewhat fondly of the gentleman from the start. Their conversation on the terrace at Lucas Lodge the evening before had been so enlightening. Just the remembrance of the way she felt when he kissed her palm was enough to make her heart flutter hours later. Now he is coming to see me. Mr. Fitzwilliam Darcy was the last man in the world whom she could have expected to call on her at Longbourn. Just thinking of all the harsh words that she had spoken against him to anyone who would listen to her complaints about her perceived deficits in his character gave her cause for regret. "I complained to my friend Charlotte that Mr. Darcy is no doubt the most miserable man in all of Derbyshire. I disagreed wholeheartedly with Jane, who defended him, positing he was an honorable but respectable man who was merely shy. I agreed with Mamma in her adamant contention that Mr. Darcy is haughty and above his company." Oh, how earnestly did she then wish that her former opinions of the gentleman had been more reasonable, her expressions more moderate. It would have spared her the awkwardness she now felt. "Pray, my mamma and my younger sisters Kitty and Lydia will say or do nothing that will give Mr. Darcy reason to suspect how unforgivingly I have spoken against him since his arrival in Hertfordshire." Turning to her sister, Elizabeth said, "I dare not deny that I did not always think so favorably of Mr. Darcy as I do now. But in such a case as this, a good memory is unpardonable." She squeezed her sister's hand. "Now, Jane, you are much too generous to disagree with me, and you must promise me that this is the last time either of us shall ever remember anything I might have felt in the past. Do I have your promise?" Smiling contentedly, Jane nodded. "I knew I could rely on you." That said, Mr. Darcy merely asked for permission to call on me. None of the particulars were established. Who is to say the gentleman did not awaken this morning, and upon realizing what he has done, change his mind entirely? He may very well be halfway to London as we speak. Not that I would fault him. Well, he had made it clear that he did not hold her in contempt. He had made no such claims about her mother and her younger sisters. She shuddered a little in remembrance of her family's behavior the evening before, Mary's insistence upon exhibiting her performance fodder for censure and derision. Added to that was the specter of Kitty and Lydia flaunting themselves in front of the officers in attendance. Finally, there was her mother's tacit encouragement of the girls' antics. "I dare say no one can accuse Mr. Darcy of being inconstant," Jane said. "He strikes me as someone who knows his own mind. If he said he will come, then he will come." Jane only saw the good in people, a trait that Elizabeth did not always deem admirable. But in this case, she wanted nothing more than to share in her sister's generosity of spirit. "If indeed he does come, I must also prevail on you to help temper our mother's behavior. I also ask that you stay close to my side when Mr. Darcy arrives, Jane, unless of course he comes with Mr. Bingley, which he very well may." I doubt an armed militia could prevent Mr. Bingley from calling on you with such a convenient excuse as accompanying his friend. By that same logic, I suppose it is also possible that Caroline might call on Longbourn as well. She may very well consider it her duty," said Jane. It vexed Elizabeth exceedingly that her sister was utterly blind to Caroline Bingley's pernicious ways. She cried, "Pray she does not come. I know how much you like her, Jane. But I shall never share your good opinion of either Caroline or her sister, Louisa Hurst. Indeed, I would rather Mr. Darcy break his promise to me, if his being here means I am to be subjected to Caroline's company." Chapter 3. This Tender Regard. Darcy entered the paddock alone. He had not waited for his friend Bingley to accompany him on his morning call to the Bennets, for fear that Bingley's younger sister Caroline might discover his plan and insist upon joining them. Because he was staying at Netherfield with his friend, and because Caroline was presiding over her brother's table, she supposed she was one of Darcy's intimate friends. She could not have been more mistaken, but as he had done nothing to elevate her hopes, he felt little inclined to deflate them. He immediately recalled the conversation the evening before, when their party had returned to Netherfield after the previous evening's gathering at Lucas Lodge. "You are considering how insupportable it would be to pass many evenings in this manner, in such society, and indeed I am quite of your opinion. I, for one, was never more annoyed. The insipidity, and yet the noise, the nothingness, and yet the self-importance of all those people. What would I give to hear your strictures on them?" "Your conjecture is totally wrong," he uttered in response to Caroline's teasing retort, meant once again to disparage her brother's new neighbors. He had concluded by saying, "I assure you, my mind was more agreeably engaged. I have been meditating on the very great pleasure which a pair of fine eyes in the face of a pretty woman can bestow. It simply would not do for him to let her know he had promised to call on the young lady who had the credit of inspiring such a telling reflection." Poised to enter Longbourn Manor for the first time ever, Darcy reminded himself once again what he was about. "I would never forgive myself if I did not explore this tender regard I suffer for Miss Elizabeth." Soon enough, he was shown into the parlor where 6 women of varying degrees of beauty and poise stood awaiting him. "We are honored by this visit, Mr. Darcy. How considerate of you indeed," Mrs. Bennet said, as soon as all the usual civilities were exchanged. "However, where is your friend Mr. Bingley? Pray, he has not returned to London again?" "Bingley remains at Netherfield," Darcy replied. "That is welcome news indeed. Why, soon on the heels of his initial arrival in Hertfordshire, he was unable to accept an invitation to dinner here at Longbourn because he was obliged to be in town the following day. I was beginning to fear he might always be hurrying about from one place to another, and never settled at Netherfield as he ought to be." Darcy knew not what to say in response to Mrs. Bennet's declaration, and thus he remained silent. Caroline Bingley's shrill voice teasing him on what a charming mother-in-law the woman seated across from him would not be silenced. "And of course she will always be at Pemberley with you." He shook his head imperceptibly to clear away such thoughts. It is one thing to entertain such notions as a means of vexing Miss Bingley, but it is much too soon to countenance these sorts of ideas at such a time as this. "And what about you, Mr. Darcy? Is it your intention to remain in Hertfordshire for very long, or will you soon be returning to your own home in Derbyshire?" Darcy cleared his throat. "My plans remain unfixed. That said, I do not anticipate leaving any time soon." Here he paused a moment and gazed at the second eldest Bennet daughter, who was sitting too far away for his comfort. "Certainly not so long as I have ample reason to stay." It secretly pleased him when he noticed the undeniable object of his admiration, color. "Capital!" Mrs. Bennet exclaimed, as if Touched by a stroke of genius, she cried, "Lizzie, my dear, what a pleasant morning this is to go to Oakham Mount. It is a nice long walk, and Mr. Darcy has never seen the view, I am sure." She looked at the gentleman, and in response to his silent confirmation of her speech, she continued, "Mary, Kitty, and Lydia, I insist you join your sister and our guests." Each of the three younger sisters objected to this scheme in their turn, concluding with young Lydia, who cried, "Why can't Jane accompany them? She is the oldest, and I am sure she has nothing better to do, whereas Kitty and I have made plans to walk to Meriden. I am sure I would require Jane to remain here with me. Mary, you must be the one to accompany your sister and Mr. Darcy." In the wake of Mary's ensuing protest, Jane stood. "I am happy to walk to Oakham Mount." "Thank you, Jane," Elizabeth said, standing. Before her eager mamma could protest, she looked at Mr. Darcy. "Sir, will you pardon my sister and me while we go upstairs to get our bonnets?" "I shall eagerly await your return." On the way to Oakham Mount, Elizabeth, Jane, and their gentleman companion chanced upon Elizabeth's intimate friend, Miss Charlotte Lucas, who was on her way to Longbourn. The four of them greeted each other in the usual way, and thereupon decided that Charlotte, an excellent walker in her own right, would accompany her friends. This made for a more comfortable arrangement, relieving Jane of the burden of being a third in a cozy picture of two. But it settled upon Elizabeth the daunting task of walking side by side with Mr. Darcy, whose taciturn nature was on full display. Each step took the couples farther and farther apart from each other, and soon the two ladies had outpaced Darcy and Elizabeth by a considerable distance. This sight of her walking companion was not foreign to Elizabeth, but as he had been the one to call on her, she rather expected him to exert a greater attempt at liveliness. As if for no other reason than to silence her own internal debate, Elizabeth said, "I must credit my mamma with one thing. It is indeed a lovely day for a walk." She almost regretted her speech, fearing the introduction of such a threadbare topic as the weather would hardly portend well for any meaningful intercourse. When he merely responded in a monotone syllable, she sought to speak directly on a more substantive matter. "I too share my mamma's curiosity as regards your plans to remain in Hertfordshire, sir. I should imagine any number of places that you would find infinitely more desirable than the small confines of Meriden. In saying that, you have confirmed something I have long suspected about you." "Oh, and what is that?" "Your recognition of the somewhat limiting confines of this part of the country assures me that you are well-traveled. Do you spend a great deal of time in London, or Bath perhaps? You cannot always have been at Longbourn." "While I have had ample opportunity to spend time in London with my aunt and uncle, Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner, I am afraid I am not quite so worldly as you suppose, nor anywhere near so well-traveled as I would wish. My father's hatred of London is only exceeded by his disdain of every other place beyond Longbourn village." Not wanting to leave it at that, she said, "I suppose that is the reason I am so interested in reading. I am able to immerse myself so thoroughly in a good book that I often feel as though I am a part of it." I am delighted to say that I share my own passion for books. Indeed, my propensity to lose myself in a good book has often been cited by those who know me best as a failing. If such a thing as losing yourself in a good book is deemed a failing, then it is good to know I find myself in such estimable company, Elizabeth said, smiling. Finally, a topic worthy of discussion on this, her first walk with Mr. Darcy, and one that excited both their passions no less. A pleasing start indeed. Chapter 4. Speaking in Confidence. A few days later, breakfast was scarcely over when a servant from Netherfield brought the following note from Jane for Elizabeth. "My dearest Lizzie," the letter began, "I find myself very unwell this morning, which I suppose is to be impugned to my getting wet through yesterday. My kind friends will not hear of my returning till I am better. They also insist on my seeing Mr. Jones. Therefore, do not be alarmed if you should hear of his having been to me, and, excepting a sore throat and headache, there is not much the matter with me. Yours, etc." As much as Elizabeth wished to attend her sister, who no doubt had fallen ill after having traveled on horseback to the neighboring estate of Netherfield Park during a rainstorm, she was not entirely impervious to how her arrival might appear to those who were inclined to judge her. Her sister Mary's words played out in her mind. "I admire the activity of your benevolence, but every impulse of feeling should be guided by reason, and, in my opinion, exertion should always be in proportion to what is required." Even her mother had been wary of the scheme, albeit for different reasons. Elizabeth sighed in recollection of her mother's speech. "How can you be so silly?" Mrs. Bennet had complained. "What will Mr. Darcy think when you arrive, unfit to be seen? Surely such a spectacle will give him considerable pause, and thus undo all our hard work to get him to marry you." It would have been pointless to argue with her mother, whose business in life was getting rid of her unwed daughters. In truth, marrying Mr. Darcy had not even crossed Elizabeth's mind. Not exactly, and thus she held her tongue. Her father had also voiced some measure of concern by offering to call for the horses so Elizabeth might take the carriage. Fancying herself an excellent walker, she had declined the gesture. "I appreciate my family's concerns, but as my reasons have everything to do with being by my sister's side, I can hardly allow them to persuade me against my purposes. My sister means everything to me, and I shall not neglect her, even if it means losing Mr. Darcy's good opinion." Undeterred, Elizabeth hurried on her way, crossing field after field with abandon at a determined pace. At last, she found herself within view of the house. Elizabeth was immediately shown into the breakfast parlor and found the room occupied by Mr. Bingley and his sister, Miss Bingley. She breathed a sigh of relief that Mr. Darcy was not present, thus sparing her the potential embarrassment of his seeing her in such a state as her mother had predicted. Her hair windswept, and her hem 6 inches deep in mud. Shortly after all the necessary pleasantries the occasion afforded were exchanged, Miss Bingley tore herself away from the table and proceeded to escort Elizabeth to her sister's bedside. To Elizabeth's dismay, none other than Mr. Darcy entered the room. The two of them had barely exchanged greetings before Miss Bingley cried, "Pray come along, Miss Eliza. You have ventured too far, by foot no less, to keep your dear sister waiting." Elizabeth readily conceded, and the two of them went on their way. The young lady wasted no time showing Elizabeth to Jane's room before returning downstairs to the others. Elizabeth walked to her sister's side. There Jane slept peacefully. As much as she wanted to let her sister know that she was there, Elizabeth did not have the heart to awaken Jane from her restful slumber. Consoling herself with the awareness that the Bingleys were indeed taking prodigious care of Jane, Elizabeth scanned the room for a convenient place to sit and wait for Jane to stir. No sooner had she resolved to sit in a large comfortable chair by the window did she remember that in her haste to be by Jane's side, she had escaped Longbourn without the book she had been reading the evening before. "I suppose I might find something to read in the library," she considered. She looked back at Jane for a moment or two and then quit the room. "I am sure I shall find a book to read and return to my dearest Jane's side in no time at all." When she arrived at the bottom of the stairs, Elizabeth was pleasantly surprised to espy a footman, for although she had a sense of the location of Mr. Bingley's library, she wanted to be sure. He must have read her inquisitive expression. "May I be of service to you, madam?" "Indeed, may I inquire about the direction of the library?" "It is down the hallway, 3 doors on the left. I am happy to escort you." She held up her hand. "No, thank you. I believe I am able to find it on my own." With that said, she walked away, grateful that it was only a footman that she had encountered, and not one of the Bingley sisters. While it was true that the two of them were kind enough to Jane, their tolerance for Elizabeth was considerably less, although not at all unlike Elizabeth's level of tolerance for the two of them. "The sooner I am away from Netherfield, the better for all parties concerned." Moments later, Elizabeth pushed the door of the library open and peeked inside. If either of the Bingley sisters were present, she would forego the pleasure of a book. She breathed a sigh of relief upon observing the room appeared to be empty. She stepped inside. A quick glance in the direction of the stacks did not bode well for her reading prospects. Nevertheless, Determined to be pleased with whatever she might find, Elizabeth proceeded directly across the richly carpeted floor. The sound of a gentleman clearing his throat halted her steps. She turned. "Mr. Darcy." He walked toward her, bowed, and said, "Miss Elizabeth." Remembering herself, Elizabeth curtsied. "I trust you found your sister, Miss Bennet, to be well taken care of?" "Yes, it would appear so." Feeling the awkwardness of her current situation and the possibility that she had intruded on the gentleman's privacy, she said, "Actually, Jane was resting so peacefully when I looked in on her that I did not dare awaken her, not knowing all the particulars of the morning. I thought I would come here and pick out a book to read while I waited for her to awaken." He glanced over at the mostly empty bookshelves. "I do not know that you will have much luck in that endeavor. Might I suggest you have a look at this?" Mr. Darcy asked, referring to the book he was holding. "I do not dare accept your kind offer, sir. I fear my being here uninvited may be viewed as an impertinence. I should not wish to compound my transgression by claiming your reading material." "No, I insist. Besides, I have read this book before. It is one of my own that I am forced to read again, owing to the scarcity in my friend Bingley's library. I believe you will enjoy the book very much. In fact, you are welcome to bring it to Longbourn upon your return." She accepted the proffered book with a tentative smile. "Sir, you are very kind." Their eyes met. For a time, it seemed neither was willing to be the first to look away. At length, Elizabeth withdrew hers. "Sir?" She spoke tentatively. "Yes," he replied softly. Their eyes fixed on each other's once again. "Will you allow me to apologize if it seems that I have deliberately placed myself in your path? I assure you that was not my intention." "Are you referring to coming here to be by your ailing sister's side?" "You might have questioned if my doing so was ill-advised, especially in view of my appearance, my hem 6 inches deep in mud, my hair windswept and unkempt, and my expression, no doubt, hurried and wild-eyed." He laughed just a little at Elizabeth's description of herself. "I am not one who normally takes note of a lady's wardrobe. As for your hair, I found it quite refreshing, loosely draping your shoulders. And as for your eyes, I find they were brightened by the exercise." Elizabeth felt her color rise in response to his warm words, and she began to sense that all would be well, whatever was the opinion of Bingley's sisters on her being there. Mr. Darcy did not share their feelings. "Miss Bennet is very fortunate to have a sister as loving and supportive as you. I would wish for no less for my own sister, Georgiana." "As her older brother, indeed her only brother, I am sure you must dote on Miss Darcy exceedingly." "Indeed I do, but it is not quite the same. There is the matter of the difference in our ages. She is my junior by more than a decade." Her spirits rising to playfulness, Elizabeth said, "With 4 sisters in total, I am sure I would gladly lend at least one of them to Miss Darcy." Once again, he laughed a little, and Elizabeth could only imagine it had to do with his thought on how his sister would get along with girls so silly as Kitty and Lydia. If such were indeed his sentiments, he did not speak on it. In all their time together, since he had called on her at Longbourn, he had never uttered a disparaging word against her younger sisters, regardless of their antics. He said, "I sense that you have longed for a brother somewhere along the way." She sighed. "More than you know," Elizabeth said wistfully. "A male heir to our family's estate would have made all the difference in the world, I am sure." Just saying the words out loud pained her, but there was something about her companion's manner that made it easier to confess her most worrisome concerns. "It cannot be easy not knowing what your family's future might be, should some ill fate befall your father. Then you understand why my mamma may at times appear rather impolitic." He nodded. "I do. Pray tell me, do you know who is the heir apparent of your father's estate?" Elizabeth shook her head. "I have never met him. On the one occasion when I spoke on the matter to my father, he said there has been a long-standing disagreement with that particular branch of our family tree, which must confound your family's apprehensions even more. Indeed, as my mother likes to say, we might be thrown out in the hedgerows as soon as my father passes. Pray that such an event as she espouses will never unfold. Smiling tentatively, she bit her lower lip. I certainly did not mean to burden you with my worries, sir. You did not, Miss Elizabeth. Nothing pleases me more than spending time with you. While I join you in praying for your sister's speedy recovery, I shall not be unhappy to have the chance to spend more time getting better acquainted with you. Images of Miss Bingley's reaction to such a declaration sprang to Elizabeth's mind. I can think of at least one or two people who might take umbrage with such a prospect and balk at the impropriety. As if speaking in confidence, Darcy leaned closer to Elizabeth. We must be careful to avoid giving rise to suspicion. Do you not consider that such a thing is easier said than done? Are we not alone at this very moment, with no one to attest to what the two of us are doing? He tucked his hands behind his back. Your point is well taken. Shall I step outside into the hallway and summon a footman to attend us? Elizabeth clutched Mr. Darcy's book to her chest. She smiled. That will not be necessary. Now that you have satisfied my reason for being here by lending me your book, I think it is time for me to return to my sister's side. Of course, I shall not delay you a moment longer. I will, however, ask that you do not hesitate to seek me out if you are in need of anything at all. I am at your service. I shall take your offer into consideration, sir. Curtsying, she then turned away and proceeded to quit the room. A warm feeling washed over her when she glanced over her shoulder and saw that he was still looking at her in the manner that she had now come to appreciate as admiration. You have been listening to Irrevocably Gone, Part 1, written and read by P.O. Dixon, inspired by P.O. Dixon's best-selling short story, A Tender Moment. I hope you're enjoying this story. Stay tuned for Part 2 to find out what happens next. Coming soon.